All right.
You're gonna trim the recording so we can still like have chit chat before it gets like official, right? Like,
yeah.
I don't want to start off by being the first thing on the recording talking about.
No, absolutely not. We're leaving that in. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks for coming in. Welcome to our Radial Survey conversation series. I'm really excited to continue this conversation. We started this a little bit at the opening, and now we'll have an opportunity to continue to dig into some really amazing work, contextualized by some amazing writing. So I'm going to share my screen, and we will get started.
No, that's all right. We're on camera.
All right, so this is our Radial Survey conversation series, and this is a continuation of the an event we put together for the opening, which was a symposium which put a lot of the artists from the show in conversation with each other, in addition to the writers who had contributed essays to the Radial Survey catalog around different themes. Sorry, just gonna keep admitting people from the waiting room. But before we get started too far, I just want to talk about two things. Quickly, on January 20th, we'll have our final conversation from the Radial Survey conversation series called The Once and Future Past, which also deals with a lot of themes of time and places in time, very similar to, I think, what Kate and some of these artists are thinking about. And that'll be with Anita Bateman, Anik Jordan, and Jay Simple. So do join us for that. That'll also be online. And then for an in-person event, we will have our next exhibition opening once Radial Survey comes down, with Patricia Vulgaris and Whitney Hubbs for their exhibition titled Mousetrap. So there's some work on the website from that exhibition you can check out, and that should be a really great show. In case you don't know what the Radial Survey is, I'll just do the spiel really quickly. I'm sure some of you have heard it already. But this is sort of the Silver Eye take on the big biennial exhibition, except we decided to define our region as what we call the radius, which is kind of this big expanse between, New York and Chicago, between these art capitals, like all these places that I think have a lot in common with Pittsburgh, places like Buffalo, like West Virginia, and of course we have Njamieh Njie tonight, the artist representing Pittsburgh from the radius, the center. And if you take a look at the catalog, you can purchase one, or you can look at the download. There's a conversation with Leo Shu and I, digging deep into this idea of what is the radius and how we defined it. So tonight we have three artists, and we have the amazing Kate Kelley, formerly of Silver Eye Center Photography, formerly of Silver Eye, currently the communications and administrative coordinator at the Carpenter Center in Harvard. And she, I think, really beautifully put together some thoughts about how the past is never really past, with the work of these three artists who are, I think, are reckoning with three very different kinds of pasts in three very different ways. And again, tonight we'll be hearing from Njamieh Njie, Raymond Thompson Jr., and Brian Arthurs. So I'm going to pass it over to Kate in a second, but I just wanted to kind of prime ourselves with one quote. Actually, before I do that, I also want to, because Kate Kelley is no longer with Silver Eye, I want to quickly introduce Helen Trompiteller, who is the new deputy director at Silver Eye. So I just want to say welcome, Helen. She put together a lot of this slideshow and is, a couple days in and already helping immensely. And we're really, really happy to have you here. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, I just thought this quote, I think, was a good way of contextualizing, I think, some of the main themes in Kate's essay in this work. In the end, maybe time is inherent to photography, but it's also flexible and therefore able to be wielded in different ways to different ends. All three of these artists reject notions of resolution as their work endeavors to keep the past active in the present and create testaments to persistence for the future. And I think the thing that really stood out to me about that quote and that sentence when I read it was this idea of thinking about photography or artists wielding time, like almost like a weapon or something. The tool, the way we think of time operating in photography is kind of simple and straightforward, right? It's a moment from the past, but it's never really that straightforward. It's always a little more complex.
At Bard College.
So
I think someone's not on mute, just as a heads up.
yeah, I think I got him. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kate, and I'll have her introduce the essay and introduce the theme. Kate Kelley, everyone.
Thank you, David. It feels very funny to me to be introduced from afar, but I'm really happy to be reconnecting with this project, to be reconnecting with these artists, and most of all, I think to be reconnecting with Silver in some way. This is, I think, as David mentioned, the second iteration of this project, and I was lucky enough to also work on the first iteration of Radial Survey. And a question that's kind of stuck with me that is definitely present in this quote that David pulled out is this idea of time and how time moves differently in different places. I was new to the Radius when I moved to Pittsburgh in fall of 2017. And I was really struck by the different conversations I was able to have with different artists about the way that time moved for them in different ways, whether it was personal or historic, the way that they were thinking about the past and pulling it into the future. And maybe most importantly, the way that they were so driven to think about the narratives and timelines that were hidden and buried and were really, I think, in so many ways inspired to pull them into the present and to discuss them in ways that would allow us to continue to have conversations about them into the future. And so when we started to put together Radial Survey Volume 2, especially as this overall idea of inheritance, as we've kind of subtitled this exhibition, was also present, I was thinking a lot about pulling this idea of temporality and how important it is to photography into the conversation. And I think the work of Njamieh and Ryan and Raymond really tackled this in interesting ways. I'm going to let all three of these artists talk about their own work in their own words. But for me, to give a bit of a preface, and Njamieh has really beautifully tied historical narratives into her own personal ones, I think in very tender, but also very clear-cut ways, which is not an easy balance to strike. Ryan has created these photographs that allow us to spend time while also contemplating ideas of resistance and of action in ways that I think allow us to tease apart really interesting elements of how do we combat ideas that we find difficult? What are the ways in which we take respite? These ideas of pushing forward and action, but also making room for rest, for relaxation, and for joy. And Raymond has done something really interesting where he's taken this moment in this historical moment in time in West Virginia and completely pulled it into the present and allows it to become palpable, taking this historic event that made us, the audience who was privy to his photographs, able to almost feel it in an embodied way. And I think these are three really incredibly interesting projects that allow us to think about the way that time operates. And as I've said in this quote that David's pulled out, can be wielded. And I think that word wielded is so important in these photographs because these artists are doing things so intentionally and so powerfully. And it really does feel as though they've taken these things that we take for granted with photography, time, and they are wielding it in their own ways, in different ways, to different ends. So with that, I think I will turn it over to the three artists to discuss their own work, and we can enjoy hearing from them for a little bit before we return to questions.
Thanks,
Kate and David, can you all hear me? Okay, thanks. Hey everyone, happy Wednesday evening. It's really nice to be here with you all to talk a little bit about my work and hear from these other two brilliant folks as well. Again, my name is Njamieh. I'm from Pittsburgh, born and raised, and the work that I have in Radial Survey is about Pittsburgh. It's very much so born out of the pandemic and is made in response to the pandemic, but it's made in recognition that we can't address the present without revisiting the past. So I'll just go ahead and read this because I wrote it and I think it still holds up. So the body of work is called This Is Where We Find Ourselves. It's both this exhibition version and it's also a book. So This Is Where We Find Ourselves began as a response to the pandemic and the uprisings of the summer of 2020. As I started making pictures in my hometown of Pittsburgh, I realized I was gravitating towards sites that were connected to my personal history, my family's history, and Black history in the city. The through line is that many of these spaces have been shuttered, gentrified, or demolished altogether. This body of work is an exploration of how this legacy of loss has brought us to today, and it's a meditation on the people, the memories, and the communities that have brought us this far. So this project started off as a grant. David reached out to me to see if I might want to collaborate on a grant that whole purpose was to document what was going on in the summer of 2020. And so, you know, I started off kind of making pictures of like signs with mask signage and social distancing signage. But the thing that I noticed very saliently was that as I was moving across the city was under construction. And it was curious to me that in this time where so many things are failing and so many people are suffering, that the city could be managing to rebuild itself. And it felt like kind of Pittsburgh was scrubbing itself of a history that was still being lived in order to move on to a new chapter. So David, actually, can we go back to the previous slide? Thank you. So what I decided to do, and well, this wasn't a conscious decision, this is what kind of evolved into the project. I really wanted to take a moment to hold space and to kind of preserve what the city is or what the city was at a very particular moment in time, while reaching back to the past and thinking about what I wanted to hold moving forward. And so it was a process of unearthing memories and stories and places and the people who have inhabited them. I think of this project as a simultaneous act of reclaiming, so going back to get people and things, but also preservation and thinking about how we preserve in light of the many things that we know have been lost. So what you'll see, and I'll kind of read through a few of these panels, is really a replication or a simulation of me moving through the city and kind of taking you as the viewer with me. So it starts off with places that I know very well. And I'm documenting these physical locations. And so I'm moving through the city spatially, but with the text, that's like my handwritten text, hoping to move us through time as well. So just as a kind of sample of the flow of the text and the flow of the images, the first one, it's the first pandemic summer. When we come to the yard for Sunday dinner, we remember home. Home is it tag and riding bikes and long walks to talk about everything and nothing at all. And we can go to the next one. And home is morning shortcuts to school with Whammo or the news or 70s soul on the radio. These days, home is something to hold on to when nothing's like it was. home is something to question when too much is like it's been. And yeah, it kind of goes on from there. So I'm really trying to thread the needle between personal experience and larger city regional events, as evidenced with this panel on the right, the destruction of the Lower Hill District as a result of urban renewal in the city of Pittsburgh. And I'm also trying to thread the needle between the past and the present, again, to show that the past, present, and future, I think, are constantly colliding. And the title, like, this is where we find ourselves, it speaks to we in the like personal and familial sense, but it also speaks to the we in terms of those of us living in the city of Pittsburgh, those of us, you know, living in Western Pennsylvania. We are moving through this intersection of the past, the present, and the future together through this shared space that we inhabit. What we're taking from the past, you know, how we're experiencing the future differs. And I think I'm just trying to call attention to some very specific things, born of my own history and my own story, while interrogating the powers that be, and kind of asking these questions of, why is there this loss? Why has there been this kind of sustained and fabricated loss? But also trying to really call attention to the sense of love and community and endurance that the people within the city, particularly Black folks in my case, have embodied in order to make it this far. That's what I got. And that's the exhibition view. So the like physical installation, it can be interpreted many ways, but it's kind of like you follow their text, you follow the panels, and kind of make your own path through the city through following them around. That's what I got. Thank you.
Thank you, Njamieh, and we'll hold our questions. We'll have all the artists present, then we'll kind of save discussion for the end. So next up is Raymond.
Hello, everybody. My name is Raymond Thompson Jr. I am currently living in Austin, Texas. I just moved here about 6 months ago. And my work that's in the show is called Appalachian Ghosts. It is a set of images. The project is a large project, but these images come from two projects. One is called Tunnelitis, and one is called The Dust, which are like sub-projects within Appalachian Ghosts. But I'll just give you guys a little background about the projects. So in the 1930s, migrant laborers came from all over the region of West Virginia and the South in general to work on the construction of a 3-mile tunnel to divert to the New River near Fayetteville, West Virginia. During the process, workers were exposed to a pure silica dust due to improper drilling techniques. Many developed a lung disease known as silicosis, which is estimated to have caused the death of nearly 800 workers. Up to 2/3 of those workers were African Americans. But what struck me was that besides, a very small plaque at the Hawks Nest Tunnel State Park, there isn't actually a whole lot to mark this really large event in the history of West Virginia. Some people have called the Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster like one of the worst industrial disasters in the United States history. And I was like, well, we would never know that going to this site or place what had happened in this space. And also there's very sparse visual documentation available about the event. It's almost as if somehow like somebody went to try to erase this event from West Virginia history. And when you go to the archive, and see what's there, like very little, actually shows the people who are in the space. Most everything was, most everything that's available was there to document an industrial process. So in Appalachian Ghosts, I explored the visual possibilities of what time and place look like using primary source materials to recreate workers' experiences in photographs. I've recontextualized and represented archival photographs originally made to document the construction of Hawks Nest Tunnel Dam and Powerhouse. And the few people who are caught in the archive are often nameless and voiceless workers. Specifically, I'm looking at what has been left out in Afro-American visual history, which to date, many has been documented from a colonial or white gaze. And from this standpoint, I've sought to recreate work that has been informed by and made from historical documents and photographs. So I came to this story after I read an article and the essay and the Book of the Dead by Maura Kaiser. And once I read the story, I was so generally touched by it. And I was coming from a background of being a photojournalist, and I just, was really, really struck by the story, but then was always wondering how come no one remembers the story in the space where I was living in West Virginia at the time. And from there, like I wanted to sort of, and realizing that there was so many African Americans that worked in this space, it kind of connected to me because it's like so much of so much African American experience and involvement in American history often gets pushed down or forgotten about or erased or isn't recorded. And this project was an effort to try to bring them back into this space of visual history, bring them back into an archive in which they had been left out of, and essentially creating a speculative archive in which we could sort of begin to have conversations about this one aspect of American history in which it was clear that, African Americans played a vital role in. But ultimately, I think I have been on the search to sort of find these stories in the American landscape and American history, and to work to tease out these things in a visual way. So many things are left oral histories or left to other people looking at, the surveillance of other people looking at people and then writing down the history, and that's what we have to go by. And this is an attempt to sort of take that, use it, but then also kind of flip it on its head a little bit. So the work in the show comes from two parts of this project: the dust, which is a series of men being covered by this dust and silicosis, and then images from the series called Tonalitis, which is inspired by a Maura Kaiser poem describing what the space looked like inside and outside the tunnel. Dust and Tonalitis are the ones that sort of come from this space, and they both in there gives you related by this idea of this dust, this cloud, and it at times really, really beautiful, but at the same time it's like raining down this sort of death upon these figures at the same time. So that is pretty much what I have for this. Yeah, thank you. And this is what it looks like at the show.
Thank you, Raymond. And last but not least, Ryan.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here tonight. I'm in Buffalo, New York. As an artist and a photographer, a lot of my work deals with themes of masculine identity, exploring kind of physical, mental, and bodily spaces where men go to kind of exert themselves, improve themselves. I've worked with various branches of the military and extreme kind of sports and whitewater kayaking, and grew up doing long canoe tripping. And so a kind of sense of being informed by the landscape, but also a sense of camaraderie and kind of looking through a kind of shared sense of navigating these spaces. But the work that I'm sharing and that's in the show is new work, and it's actually work that remains in progress called Nothing of Weeds. And it's exploring some of the landscapes around Western New York and Buffalo that I had moved away from for a long time, for about 17 years. And a big part of the narrative is also around kind of my coming out, in my 20s, and then kind of returning to a landscape and kind of imagining myself or kind of reacquainting myself with a landscape that felt quite fraught and charged in, I guess, the challenge of being younger and gay in rural places, and feeling like I needed to live in larger cities in San Francisco and places like Boston, and kind of finding opportunities to connect with a much more kind of diverse group of people outside of these kind of smaller rural spaces. So this body of work is, as I said, kind of new, and I've been using a book as kind of a bit of a guiding principle to kind of explore these spaces. And it's kind of a revolutionary book, part manifesto, kind of part fable, called The Faggots and Their Friends Between Revolutions. And it kind of talks about this kind of kingdom that's crumbled and that's been led by man. And it felt like a really apt parable to be exploring right now, or in especially supercharged during the presidential election, and kind of exploring these spaces that felt kind of very charged with election signs and Blue Lives Matter signs, and just kind of fraught with this kind of tension. Not only that, with COVID, and exploring spaces that feel like maybe visitors and often are marked as not being welcome to trespassers or others. So I'm exploring this kind of sense of verdancy. The edit that's at Silver Eye is quite celebratory, but the larger body of work kind of deals with a bigger array of kind of these issues. But the body of work, or the sequence that I've created at Silver Eye is quite celebratory, quite jubilant, and it's thinking about the kind of interplay between degradation and verdancy in these rural spaces, and how these photos kind of hold cycles of kind of growth and decay in crops and in livestock, but also opening up space of conversation about the weeds, and the weeds being this kind of doubled metaphor for preponderance of both right-wing ideologies in rural communities, but also the struggles of finding and maintaining a presence as a queer person. So these narratives kind of emerge, and there's a sort of kind of beauty and a kind of tension and kind of finding respite in these places. A lot of the passages and a lot of the photos are being titled by passages, and maybe I'll just read one quickly that can kind of describe a little bit about the kind of mentality that I kind of try to enter while I'm making these pictures, and then kind of sequence and kind of embody. Nothing can defeat the spirit of the earth. The fairies know that the earth will not tolerate the men much longer. The earth, scarred and gouged and stripped and bombed, will deny life to the men in order to stop the men. The fairies have left the men's reality in order to destroy it by making a new one. So the book kind of goes through these kind of characters. There's friends. They include these kind of strong, radical women and feminists, and queens being drag queens, and women who love women being lesbians, and these kind of fairies, which are kind of radical kind of figures. And so this book has been, it was written, I need to look, but in the 1970s in a kind of queer utopia outside of Ithaca. So it all kind of felt like oddly specific, both to a landscape that I'm exploring, but also kind of to a text that I wasn't, there wasn't anyone passing these kind of texts on. And I think it's a result of a generation lost to AIDS and another epidemic, but this kind of information kind of finding its way, and then kind of making these pictures that can kind of capture this sense of exploration. And this sequence, really something that's about kind of joy and verdancy and cleansing and kind of a removing. So the bottom row has this flame, this kind of eternal flame, this naturally lit gas waterfall, this flame that's behind a waterfall that feels like it's something out of The Legend of Zelda, a game, or something kind of fantastical, but kind of thinking about this kind of idea of magic and sex magic, in this kind of harmony and this kind of sense of integration, and living in a place where people can be free to garden and cultivate this kind of life outside of kind of hostility. And it just felt really appropriate for now. As I said, it's very much work in progress, but I didn't want to make an edit for this show that was about kind of structural abandonment or political alienation and rejection. I think the larger body of work has those pictures, but I wanted this particular sequence to feel kind of jubilant and celebratory and kind of free of those outside forces. Just reading through my notes. Maybe I'll just read one more quote. There is much more to be learned from wearing a dress for a day than there is for wearing a suit for a lifetime. And I think it's just kind of thinking about the possibilities of putting oneself in other positions and shoes and thinking about, yeah. So I'm trying to make work right now from a place of vulnerability, learning the work and kind of finding the ways that I can kind of tell these stories. I find myself most active. I run a gallery now, but I find myself most active in the spring, summer, and fall in terms of this work and the kind of verdancy and the kind of growth that I see in the pictures, but it remains in progress. I guess I'll end there. I have no clue if I went too fast, but you know.
No, that was great. Thank you, Ryan. So yeah, I'll turn it back over to Kate. As someone who's thought a lot about this work, where do you want to begin for our conversation?
I feel myself beginning with just thinking what I thought when we put these photos of yours, Ryan, up on the wall, how wonderful they were going to be to look at in the depths of January. And I am reminded of how nice to feel a little bit of warmth and lushness, as it is single digits outside, at least here in Cambridge. But I think
I want mentally occupied here.
Yes, exactly. And maybe that's a good place to start. I loved the first quote that you wrote about the sort of scars that the earth is bearing, and sort of the belief that those who trust and understand and know better will, or maybe not know better, but those at least who believe will kind of move forward despite this. And I think on these three projects and think about the way that scars upon the earth and upon our landscape appear throughout all three of them. And Njamieh very beautifully walked us through the different physical changes that this landscape that she knows intimately is going through, from the erasure of different neighborhoods and the erection of new urban development, for lack of a better term, going forward. Raymond, you discussed the like literal physical chiseling of the earth that these different men went through and the horrible hardship that they had to endure. And then to come back to it, to Ryan, this beautiful quote that you read from this text that's been so influential to you. And I'm struck by this idea of the scars that the earth is inheriting, those that are man-made and those that come from elsewhere, and this idea of vulnerability. And I do think there's a great deal of vulnerability in each of these projects, from lending one's own personal history to be up to the world, to digging up these archival histories and finding ways that embody them in a way that we're forced to reckon with them in the way that we feel our own bodies moving, to Ryan, to these like this new work that you've given us that is very tender, is very vulnerable, and is asking not only your viewers but yourselves to sort of think from another's perspective. And so with that in mind, I would put it to all three of you, and maybe we can start with you and Njamieh and move forward in the sequence that we did. What of yourselves, and I know this conversation is about temporality, and I'm sure that we'll get to that, but for yourselves feel you need to give to these projects in order to be able to get at of tenderness, of vulnerability, in order to kind of balance these ideas of being with one foot in the past, one foot in the present, and then yourself sort of straddling our present moment. I mean, that's a precarious position to be in, and certainly one that requires a bit of giving of oneself. So perhaps we can sort of start there and think about all these ideas of vulnerability and of giving. I think about temporality in these photographs. Just a light question.
I was like, oh man, of course I have to go first. I mean, I think for me, it was particularly challenging, this idea to like tap into this like tenderness, because I'm photographing like locations like straight up. There's really not a lot of frill involved, between the physical locations and the black and white. It's very much so like it is what it is. And so I didn't necessarily want to shrink from like the documentary aspect of it, like presenting these places as they are. But I think where the warmth hopefully comes in is through my writing and through how I'm trying to like narrate these locations. And in a way, it's like, I guess it is meant to simulate how you might be presented with a space, or like how you might encounter a space. You don't necessarily know the history behind it. I don't know the history behind all of these places, but I could tell you a little bit about my connection to it. And maybe that will make you think about your connection to either this space or to another space. And that kind of sparks a dialogue or some sort of connection that I think warms up these photos that otherwise might feel a bit distant. And yeah, and I guess the other part of it is, you know, on a very surface level, again, this project is about like loss. It's about kind of inheriting these spaces that have evolved to the point of maybe not even being recognizable anymore. But it really, I would even say more so, it is about like love and legacy, and the idea that this warmth, this strength of the human spirit is the thing that is passed down, that allows us to continue to make it and maybe make ourselves over, do what we need to do to keep on moving to the next thing. So it is very much so about, like I said, unearthing and like pulling those stories, pulling those voices, pulling that sentiment that you might not get from the coolness of the built environment or the coolness of, you know, a black and white image, and pulling that warmth, pulling that human story, that narrative to the surface, and letting that guide you through the space, as opposed to solely, you know, what meets the eye.
Yeah, I think that's felt so strongly in these photographs. And for those who haven't visited the show, so many of these photographs, they're in Njamie's handwriting to begin with, so that like also adds this like real sense of this is a person, something to you. They have this kind of like what I've always thought of as this dual geography, where so many of the places are exactly where they are, and like she's named Njamie is giving us like where this place is if you would like to go out and seek it, but it's also labeled with this place like, you know, a family member's home, the corner store, somewhere that feels like a very personal sort of location point. And I think that as well as very beautifully adds the sense of maybe giving up of oneself. And I don't know if David, you mentioned this in previous talks, but Njamie also published a book sorting this work, which is beautiful and very intimately sized. It feels kind of like a little pocket atlas or a guidebook in a way, something that you kind of toss in your jacket pocket and take with you on a journey around the city, which I also really love as a sort of gesture towards getting to know a place. Even if you do have coordinates to get around, you're kind of taking one another's voice with you on the way. So thank you, Njamie, for that. I think that's really lovely. And maybe Raymond will come to you with my not uncomplicated question at all about tenderness and vulnerability. And I've just always been so struck, especially this photo, the Tenderness number 4, the way that you've allowed this dust to kind of seep into the fingerprints, the lines of this hand that's kind of like, it's not grasping anything, it's just kind of held in space and almost like a delicate position towards us. And just the decision, maybe you could give us a little bit more about how and why you've decided to really make these photographs feel embodied as a way to pull our past into our present.
That's a really good question. It's hard because in some ways, you know, I don't have a direct connection to West Virginia, or necessarily like this story. But what has been driving me and continues to drive me towards stories like this is just simply the search for, and some weird my own being or images of people who look like me in these spaces, and trying to find the connection to the history of the land in which I live, which I mean, first of all, just, you know, live in modern times. I mean, everything gets erased, people build new stuff and keep going. But I don't know, there was something missing for me. And just the idea of like, hey, you know, I was here too, or I played a role in this in some way, even though it wasn't actually me. I still like want to know these stories. Like I want these narratives, and all these missing narratives, I think, or almost haunted me in a way, and they still do in the work that I'm currently working on or have worked on in the past couple of years. But and speaking directly to these images, or even this image of the hand, it's just I really wanted to like almost like I was watching a movie or something. I wanted to be able to see like this cinematic detail of this thing that happened as if I was standing there. So as if I could have that experience too, to sort of know what it was like. And just the ability to wonder, the ability to even imagine these things, which I feel like have been cut off from, were important to me. And that's sort of what I kind of felt connected me to stories and stories like this in American history. And just really looking for that connection to the landscape, if that makes sense. And by embodying it in this way, I was like literally like directly trying to create one, like point, A to B. So, yeah, that's what I have.
I think that urgency is so felt, and that's the thing with graphs, right? Is that we're desperately trying to seek the context that surrounded them when they were created, and how we can interpret it in our present, and how we can speculate on how it will continue to be interpreted into the future. It's constant push pull, and we'll never quite be satisfied. But the beautiful thing that I find about these photographs is that you have exactly like kind of pinpointed that, like that idea of haunting, that what's unknown will always haunt us, and the best that we can do is to sort of sit within the embodiment and try to feel what was felt, even if we can't noun. So thank you for kind of explaining in more text for kind of the thought process behind these images. And then Ryan, I would bring it back to you, and to bring us into a bit of a lush and verdant space. Your images imagine something that we don't know, but that maybe we could, in that I know, as you very rightly said, that a lot of what this larger series has to do with is a lot of tension, and this idea of weeds as this uses beautiful metaphor as weeds that are things that are not cultivated and are often kind of pushed out and eradicated, but often can be allowed to thrive along with cultivated blooms, and what a beautiful world that would be if we were able to kind of live within that sense of letting these things grow together. But something else about your photographs is that they allow us to visit spaces that we recognize, but are a little bit too perfect. I don't know if maybe in your kind of talking about these ideas that we've touched on, you'd like to speak a little bit about the process, which I find really fascinating in these photographs, that you've kind of not overexposed, but double exposed to kind of allow almost like portals into a world that's too perfect, which I think really speaks to this wonderful notion of creating moments of joy and of pleasure and respite, even if you are doing these things in order to rest, so that you can come back and return to the other ideas that you've talked about, which is resilience, and again, larger forces that would seek to. So let's finish on a little bit of lushness, maybe.
Sure, thank you. I really relate to what Raymond was saying, and so some of these pictures are really about the kind of performance of wanting to create this kind of queer existence. I spend most of my time going between a city and wanting to be in the woods, and not being able to fully live in a space that maybe community and culture that I don't have people surrounding me. So these pictures are an attempt in a lot of ways to kind of cultivate this kind of obscure kind of queer history of the past, but also kind of connect these kind of moments. And so they're kind of reenactions, but they're also kind of journals. They're kind of part of my daily diary of trying to create something as well. And in the performance of that, these things that have kind of been removed from some sort of larger kind of narrative, these kind of old stories can be kind of told over and over through the reenaction. And in doing that, it becomes this kind of tribute for these obscure kind of parts of the past. And so when talking about inheritance, thinking about, family, and I have an amazing, wonderful biological family, but I also have a queer kind of chosen family. And I'm very fortunate that one of my dad's friends is gay and is my godfather, and has provided me with this kind of queer history. And a lot of that history in some ways has been lost in the kind of telling and retelling from the AIDS epidemic. And there was a statistic I had read in November, it was actually right before the show, that was just talking about how many Academy Awards have ever been given to queer roles, and they're always around queer death and queer suffering and this kind of loss and this kind of trauma and this kind of collective trauma that gets kind of reenacted through the loss of kind of family and chosen family. And so there was something that I wanted to kind of do and kind of create this kind of beautiful queer existence that's full in the woods and, you know, bathing in the river and kind of cleansing. And so many of the pictures I create, you know, using, you know, shooting on a tripod, multiply stacking pictures to create this kind of, this heightened aperture, this kind of a greater illusion of depth of field, or just kind of randomly stitching parts of pictures into pictures and letting them collapse. And the way that I'm kind of seeing it is almost like a Dutch still life, where I want to like make pictures in the summer where there's like a snail on a tree and you know, a leaf, and like the light's perfect, and there, you know, like all of these things and this kind of impossibility kind of coming together to kind of make this moment that I can then look at, and it can kind of help me access those kind of histories and this multitude of histories, and also kind of stand as this kind of testament to give, you know, some sort of strength and a testament. And also when it's done, it's a reflection on the life and the friendships and the people that I'm making pictures with and for, most often my husband and other friends. So I feel like the goal of trying to create this archive, not an archive, but to create this body of work that can be a testament to joy, helps me pursue joy in this moment that feels super dark. And so I kind of want to embody and be in these pictures that I'm creating that are fantasy reenactment. And it's new, it's probably more personal and other work that I've made that deals with histories, but not as kind of much kind of mining from my own experience and location and place. Yeah.
Well, I thank you for sharing new and vulnerable work with myself and with David and with Silvereye and with all of our viewers. It's certainly something that, you know, we're all grateful and honored to be able to engage with. I thank you all for sort of walking us through the different ways that you're thinking about creating these photographs and the different kinds of balances that you've had to strike. I want to be cautious and wary of time, and if others have questions, I certainly think that's something that we can open up to as well. One kind of overarching question that I keep coming back to, both with this iteration of Radial Survey and the first as well, perhaps because I was new to the region, and Pittsburgh is one of those places that maybe you'll always be new unless we were born there, is how would this project be different if it was somewhere else? What is it about time in this region, the places within this region, that has allowed us to create this particular project? And I'm not sure if that question really has one nice, neat, tidy answer, but it is something that I would put out to the group, to the audience, to the artists, maybe in particular to question, like, what is it about this part of the world? I mean, for me, ideas of like industrialization and deindustrialization and all of the education and tech that surround us certainly seem to kind of form some very meaty, tension-filled pockets of, you know, one side telling us that we're stuck in the past, the other side telling us we're moving too far in the future. But there does something to be said about special this region, like the kind of ways that it questions how time moves. So I certainly welcome questions from our audience or from our artists about those thoughts or any other in the few minutes that we have remaining together.
I'm happy to maybe just say something really quick. I feel like a lot of this work right now for me, it does feel kind of therapeutic and kind of helping me resolve. When we had our first studio visit like a year ago, it seems like I was kind of apprehensive of just thinking about myself just solely occupying this kind of radius. A lot of my work kind of comes from life. And so there's pictures in Canada and Minnesota and all these places. And so I really tried to think about the edit and wonder, was it really specific that the majority of this work is being made in Western New York? But I honestly think that I have been maybe avoiding, and I make work in certain places when I can escape mentally, maybe where I consider some of the issues are. And so a lot of the opportunity to make work for the show, and almost everything on the wall was new except for this watermelon picture, which was older, and I included because I wanted it in the show. But like, it was actually kind of very therapeutic to approach this work and address some of the kind of hostility that I felt in the area as an effort to feel present where I live and that I make where I am more specifically. So there was something about that specificity that I appreciated, and I kind of have worked, I don't think fully through. I think my pictures are always going to kind of wander, but it helped, if that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I see some other artists from this project in the audience, so I'm not going to single anyone, but if you have any thoughts as well, I do see your, or if anyone else to contribute, that would be
News and possible.
Linda. I also see a hand raised. Hello.
Okay. Hi. This technology is usually somewhat mysterious to me. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, I spent several hours today with the catalog, which David sent me as a PDF, and it was really fascinating to go through the whole second iteration of this wonderful project. I owe David an apology because 2 years ago, I told him that I didn't think it was really worthwhile publishing the results of the project, and now I want to eat those words entirely because really experiencing this today was a very nourishing. It was really a wonderfully nourishing, time that I spent. And I spent most of my time looking at Njamieh and Ryan and Raymond's work, because that's what we'd be talking about tonight. And I applaud all of you. I think you're doing really interesting projects. And Kate, your take on the notion of time is so interesting, and everyone has addressed that. But I, being, my age, I have even another perspective, which is that whatever this work says or means to us today, it will mean something different in 10 years or 20 years, or 40 or 50 years. It will take root, and it will bear new fruit, and it will have meaning that we can't even imagine right now. And I think that that's one of the, that's one of the great things about photography, because it can say so much about today, and then half a century later you can look at it with completely new eyes. And I suspect that with all three of these projects, I mean, Njamieh has made this whole body of work about a city that has been so well documented for the last 150 years. And so she now has a whole new chapter to add to that. What you've done, Raymond, in West Virginia, I think is fascinating. And I hope that, I hope that your work actually, causes some people in West Virginia to call attention to what you've uncovered. And as for, the work in Buffalo, I'm still digesting that. I'm still trying to figure out that whole notion of weeds, and I enjoy the process. So anyway, thank you very much. It's this is great. David, congratulations. This is really great.
Thank you, Linda. And here to all of our opinions being wrong and changed and completely interpreted in the future, despite our best efforts to understand in the present. I think that's part of the beauty, and I also look forward to what we'll think about this project, and hopefully what 25 looks like, and that we can revisit this work. And I'm glad we didn't listen to you for once and we published this, because hopefully we can come back and talk about it again later on. Maybe if there are no other questions, David, we could close with the word from someone. Oh, I do see a question, actually. I take that back. I see one more question. Yes, please go ahead.
Yes,
yeah.
yes, how you doing? Njamieh, how you doing? Good seeing you. I had a question for you. When I'm looking at your work, and I've been following your work for a while, it connects with me, like far as the changing of community. I think we probably talked about this early on when we first connected, about community and how things are changing. And when I look at your work, it reminds me of my own city. I live in Jersey City, and it's a lot of Jersey City, New Jersey, and there's a lot of changing that's going around, a lot of development going around. So when I'm seeing your work, it's like I can relate to it, because like you mentioned about the living in the space of past, present and future, and being living in a predominant Black community. I would like to know, what do you see your community, or what does community mean to you, right? Like now at this moment, and what would, if you could answer, what do you think the future will look like for your community in the future?
Oof, that's a big question. First of all, hey Devon, how are you? Thank you for tuning in. It's good to see you. Happy New Year.
Yeah.
That's a big question. I was reading a thread on Twitter a couple of weeks back, and it was critiquing something. It was critiquing a new film that came out for, just kind of calling out the issues, but not putting forward any solutions. And I was like, oh man, I feel like I'm very much in the putting forward issues part of my practice. But I guess the way that I see community is hopefully reflected in this work. And it's kind of what I mentioned in terms of, that lineage of love. It goes into it more in the book, but the book is very much about family and about just passing down tradition, passing down this way of seeing each other, this way of looking out for each other. And I think that's the way that I was raised. That's what I inherited within this, or these Black communities in Pittsburgh that I've had the privilege of coming up in. And so I guess I would just want to see that continue. I think, one thing about Pittsburgh is, in a lot of other cities, Black communities were more centralized or more geographically close together. But in Pittsburgh, a lot of Black neighborhoods are kind of spread apart across the city because of the topography, because of the hills and the valleys and the rivers. And so sometimes it's difficult for us logistically to connect with each other. We don't always, we're kind of far apart. But I think, I've just seen so many examples of us seeking each other out and of us coming together. And I guess the best way I could put it is, I have a friend, an artist is in town doing a residency. We met during a residency out of town. And so I brought her today to this place, Njamieh Collective in the Hill District. And everybody at Njamieh just welcomed her with open arms. And as I was sitting there watching Sister Frankie, who works at Njamieh, talk to this visitor, right? Like they were family. I was like, that's it for me. That's Black Pittsburgh. That's what I would want. That's the best part of us. This this embrace, you know, that even though there's been all of this stuff in our past, we've still been able to have that warmth and that care and that welcoming spirit. So yeah, that's a really long way to say, I guess, just being rooted in love and being rooted in knowing that there is a tomorrow, like there is a future to keep working towards. And there are things to keep passing down of who we are.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, that's the time we've allocated for tonight. So I just want to say a huge thank you to Ryan and Raymond and Njamieh, and an extra special huge thank you for Kate for moderating and writing. Really, really beautiful to reflect on all your work a little bit and to see you all tonight. So really just thank you for sharing. Thank you for being here. Thank you for thinking about photographs with us tonight.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you all.
Thanks, it was a pleasure.